Hello, I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. I'm here with Marvin Kalb at the Brookings Institution, where we're going to be speaking about his time at City College, Harvard, and his time as a young person working at the U.S. Embassy in Russia. Welcome, Marvin.
I've spent a lot of my life writing books, but all of them have been books about subjects that I have covered as a journalist. In other words, I write a great deal about Russia, I write a great deal about China, the Vietnam War, the Middle East wars, Israel, the Arabs. But I have never written about myself, my own career as a reporter. And many, many times people in the family and friends would come to me and say, it's about time. Talk to us about yourself. And I've always felt very uncomfortable doing that because as a reporter, I like to feel that there is distance between me and the subject that I'm covering. And if it's yourself, it's very difficult to put that distance in between yourself and yourself. So I finally yielded to the idea of doing the book the year I was Peter the Great, due to the insistence of my grandson, who's 12, and my granddaughter, who's 9. And they kept on saying, come on, Grandpa, do it. You keep telling us stories, do it. And so I did it. Then there was a question of what do you write about? And I thought about the period 1956 because it had a great deal to do with my own reporting career. And it was an exciting story on its own. And it had to do with my first trip to Russia. It was in 1956. I was incredibly young, inexperienced. It was my first trip abroad. These were new things to me. Everything was very exciting because each person was an adventure. Each arrival in a city in Central Asia, wow, was an adventure. And so for me, the doing of the book, the accomplishment of it in and of itself was a big deal, and I'm awfully pleased that people agree.
And I agree, it was an excellent book. One of the things that intrigued me about the book were your reflections about your time at City College. Do you think your time at City College adequately prepared you for your first job in Russia?
Yes, it did for a couple of reasons. Number one, City College was a place not for guys who wanted to fool around. You got into City College because you had a good record in your high school, which I did. I, by pure chance, happened to be the 4th in my graduating class, 94 point something as a grade average. I took education seriously because my parents were both immigrants to the United States. They both felt the incredible importance of education as part of their training of their children. And so when I went to City College, it was largely because my brother had gone to City College. And if Bernie had gone, and Marvin would go, and that's what happened. I could have gone to any number of other places because my grades were such that I would probably have gotten a scholarship somewhere. But it never occurred to me. And that's fine, because City College was serious. I learned a great deal. And in the last year, I began to study Russian history, the Russian language. I began to think seriously about what am I going to do when I finish college? And so when I finished college, the thing that my brother Bernie said to me almost immediately was, well, I mean, what are you going to do now? And I said, I'm not sure. And he said, well, you've begun to be interested in Russia. And that was in the early 1950s. That was the time that we were just beginning the Cold War. That was the time that know your enemy became a very popular slogan. And your enemy then was the Soviet Union, was global communism. And I came to an interest in Russia, not because of global communism, really because of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Russian literature. But then my brother asked me a very simple question. What are you going to do with all of that? What do you want to be? And I didn't know, but journalism was always in my mind because Bernie was a journalist, so maybe I would be one as well. And I thought about that, thought about Russia, and suddenly the connection snapped into place that I could be a journalist specializing on Russia. And so I went up to Harvard, went to the Russian Research Center, marvelous institution. They had terrific faculty. And the faculty sort of looked at each student as a test case. How do we make this person's knowledge of Russia become useful to America, to the American people, at this time of extreme tension and danger between the United States and the Soviet Union? And one day in December of 1955, a wonderful man, Marshall Shulman, who ran with the number 2 man at the Russian Research Center, called me into his office and said, I got word today from somebody in Washington, a friend of mine at the State Department. They need a translator and an interpreter at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. You've got to have a top secret clearance. You have to know the language, and you have to sort of be a sensible guy. And I thought I fit all of those categories. And I put my hand up and said, I'm ready to go. He said, but they want you there next week. I said, can I check with my parents? I said, can I have a few days? He said, no, tomorrow morning, you got to have an answer. Well, I called my father and my mother. It was the same thing on almost every other question I'd ever put to them. My father was always the adventurous guy who wanted me to go places and do things. And my mother was always very cautious. You got to look out for Marvin, be careful, that sort of thing. And my father won. I won. I left immediately for Russia. And the experience in Russia in 1956 was eye-opening, extraordinarily interesting, and a powerful story having nothing to do with me. I was just there to record it, having to do with the way a people, the Russian people, who had never experienced freedom, personal freedom, ever in their lives, going back hundreds of years. And Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union then, did something in February of 1956 which was historic. He delivered a speech that attacked the legacy of Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union for 29 years. That was historic. That was eye-opening. That was earth-shattering. You never attacked Stalin. You never whispered anything, even the old expression, under your pillow. You never did anything like that. Stalin was God. And here Khrushchev was saying he was a murderer, a criminal, a man who almost lost the war to the Nazis, a man who would kill people just for the joy of killing. And people listening to this were shocked. Some of them literally suffered heart attacks on the spot. And when the word got out, after a couple of weeks, because everything was very secret then, when the word did get out, Russians were intoxicated by the thought that if Khrushchev could attack Stalin, maybe I could attack Khrushchev. Maybe I could attack communism. Maybe I can say no when I was supposed to say yes. The early teasing moments of personal freedom that Russians felt was a magnificent experience to behold. And I went all over the country. I was the youngest guy at the embassy. I was totally unimportant. And so the ambassador, when I would go to him and say, "Can I go here?" he'd say, "Sure." And so I went everywhere, and I wrote about it in the book. And I wanted people to feel not necessarily what I felt, but I wanted them to be exposed to this exciting moment in Russian history and draw your own conclusions. But for me, it was, from a personal point of view, an extraordinary lesson in humanity. From a professional point of view, it put the bug in my head that I like this idea of going around talking to people, and I wasn't then reporting anything, except to the ambassador. When I would come back, I would tell him stories about what I had learned. But that was all secret stuff. That was all within the embassy. But the thought was, could I do it as a reporter? And I thought I could, and when I got back to Harvard, I was continuing my PhD work at that time. I got a call from Murrow, Edward R. Murrow, a great CBS journalist, and he had read something that I wrote in the New York Times Magazine, and he liked it. It was about Russian youth, and he invited me to come down to his office and talk to him. And believe me, for me, I mean, a kid, and I was a kid. I was a lucky kid. To be able to sit and talk to Edward R. Murrow was a big, big deal.
If you don't mind me saying this, Marvin, you were more than a lucky kid. You were a prepared kid. You were very prepared. And if you don't mind me further asking, what advice would you give to a student who would like to work in the diplomatic world in some fashion?
Sure. First thing is language. Absolutely. The first thing is language. I tell a lot of students today who want to be journalists, they want to go out into the world, and they immediately want to be anchormen. I said, no, calm down. There are a lot of things before you get to be an anchorman. You've got to know something. And the first thing you ought to know, in my opinion, is the language of the people you're going to be talking to, so that you are not then dependent upon an interpreter, translator, somebody, a third party, in other words. The wonder of the experiences that I was able to put into this book is the result of my knowledge of Russian and being in Russia. I was able to meet people and talk to them. At the beginning, a Russian is generally cautious when talking to a foreigner. But after 5 or 10 minutes, if they kind of like you or trust you a little bit, they open up very quickly, much more quickly than Americans, for example. And I found myself talking to people who shared the most sensitive of experiences, political experiences, emotional, cultural experiences with them. And that was because of the language. So that's number one. Number two, for me, always is literature. Read novels about life in that country before you go there. And then third is history. Every country has a personality, born of its experience, the result of its people. And if you can talk to the people and appreciate where they come from, you show respect for them. And I have found, traveling around the world, that the thing most important is don't be a big shot. Appreciate your own humanity and modesty, and appreciate and recognize that these people deserve your respect. And if you can provide them with respect, honor, I don't mean you fall down on your feet. With a Russian, for example, to show that you've read Tolstoy. You have seen Chekhov plays. You know the difference between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. That rings powerfully with them. And so, yes, I was prepared, but a lot of luck comes in. I think there's a lot of luck in it also.
Well, as you well know, there's an old expression about luck favoring the prepared mind. What advice would you give for students who are preparing to enter their careers beyond just luck? I mean, what sorts of preparations do you think they ought to do?
What I am concerned about, and I think I'll end up answering your question, what I am very concerned about is that in my experience as a teacher, and I have been teaching now at the Kennedy School at Harvard since 1987. In this period of time, when I first started teaching, what I found in a classroom was that my students were ready to talk to me, maybe not on my level of experience, but on my level of curiosity about the world, about what's going on. I was teaching then, and still do, a course on the intersection of the media and public policy, the effect of the media on our politics. You have to understand a little bit about the media and a little bit about the politics of the country. And I had a feeling that they all did, more or less, understand that. Now, in more recent years, what I find is that they're much more interested in polling, in data, in things that are measurable, as opposed to ideas that may not be measurable, but that you have to understand. The difference between a written down number and an imagined concept. And there's a difference between the two, and I found that I used to be able to talk to them much more easily about concepts. Now I have to be knowledgeable about the new technology, about social media, all of the stuff that younger people take for granted. I have no problem with that. If I were their age, I hope that I would be doing that too. What I'm concerned about is that the quest for knowledge seems to stop there, that anything you can get within the world of the social media and the new technology is good, that's acceptable. But when I ask them to forget all of that, read the Federalist Papers, find out what was in the minds of the people who started this whole process. What did they have in mind? What did they think? When you come upon a phrase like from Madison, for example, I forgot the number of the paper, that all governments are essentially groupings of men. They use the word men then, not men and women. Men. People, I will say. And people are vulnerable. People are fragile. So governments become vulnerable and fragile. You cannot create something beyond the capacity that you yourselves have within you. And today, I fear that the student mind is so absorbed with the technology that they forget that the technology is simply a means of communication. Ideas are what will drive revolutions, create political parties, create political movements. Ideas are what are fundamental, not the iPhone. And I'm a little worried about that problem.
But if students could get into conflicts by talking about difficult ideas, whether it's at Harvard or elsewhere, wouldn't it be a little safer for them to then retreat and to not talk about those ideas and to perhaps talk about things like advances in their iPhone?
I totally agree that it is easier, but to me, anyways, a purely personal comment, that's unacceptable. I think I feel very strongly that, and maybe this goes back, by the way, to my experiences in Russia in 1956. I then went back and lived there for 5 years over the next 7 or 8 years. I lived in a functioning dictatorship. And I can tell you that though it was interesting, and it was a great news story as a reporter, it's a horrible way to live. The Russian people lived through that and accepted it. They had no alternative. I was blessed I had an alternative. I'd go back to America. I always had in mind the difference between dictatorship and democracy. And for me, corny as this may sound, when I was living in Russia, I was always aware that this is a system of government I don't like. I don't like it at all. And I know that I will be free enough when my time here is over, and that is not being in a prison. That's a job that you're doing. When your job is finished, you can go back to the United States. Maybe you were sent somewhere else, but you don't have to live in a dictatorship. If you have to live in a dictatorship, what happens to the mind is that it's not that it stops working, but it works in a narrower space of permissible conduct. And I like the idea of minds that are boundless with opportunity and curiosity, and therefore minds that are free. And for me, concepts, large concepts like freedom, are far more important than any kind of technology.
What do you think the role of the universities ought to be in terms of difficult issues, when even university presidents are afraid of raising controversial or contentious issues?
There have to be university college presidents who feel that their primary responsibility is to raise ideas even if they're uncomfortable. I mean, when will you think imaginatively, if not when you're in college? When would you think in a bold way, if not when you're in college? And if we are now at a point in college where people are afraid to think, afraid to open up their minds to strange ideas, different ideas, then I don't know when they will be able to do that. And that is a fearsome thought. It's a frightening thought. If that is in fact true, that college presidents are so concerned about upsetting people, I don't know, is that a fundraising problem where they don't want to offend potential donors? If that be the problem, then really they've got to get into another line of work, because you may very well offend a donor. I always found when I go to people who are going to give money to the Shorenstein Center up at Harvard or to programs that I'm involved in here at Brookings, you may very well, by speaking boldly to a potential donor, lose the money. That is true. But you'll feel good walking away from that. And most of the time, they'll give you the money. Most of the time, they like the idea of an intellectual challenge. Sometimes they will not, and sometimes you're going to lose it.
Marvin, we only have a few minutes left. Is there any other message that you would like to deliver to students, faculty, administrators who are involved in the civic world and the campus world before we say goodbye today?
I would love for every college around the country to go back to teaching what we used to learn in early high school days. We used to call it civics. The idea that you learn a street corner level of engagement with your fellow American, your fellow citizen of Washington, D.C., whatever the community might be. Find out how you live with one another. Find out how you compromise with one another. Find out how you strike a deal with one another. Because unless you know that, You are going to live in an authoritarian state. And believe me, you lose if you live in that kind of a state. We all do. The challenge is to accept the idea that it's going to be difficult to do. And that in and of itself should make it more exciting. Let it be more difficult to do. But begin to learn about civic engagement at a young level, at a young age. Because if we do at that age, and as we go through high school and college, graduate school, whatever, you are going to be meeting different challenges along in your life's path. But if in your mind you understand that nothing can ever be really achieved unless you make a compromise, because somebody else has a perfectly good idea, you don't agree with it, but what the heck, you've got to live with the guy, make a deal. Right now, what I fear, that's why I stress the importance of civics, what I fear is that we have lost the capacity for political compromise. And that means you've lost the capacity for creative democratic thought. To me, democracy, and a manifestation of the broader concept of freedom, is an essential element of education and ought to be studied, appreciated, cultivated as the most magnificent orchid you could find.
If you would like additional information about Marvin Kalb, please visit brookings.edu. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.